discuss this culture of vocations, we necessarily must begin our conversation with an exploration into the culture of our world, especially that of North America and the United States at this time in history. So, stepping back, where we've been, the title of the conference, where we've been, I suggest that we try hard to recall the 1940s and 50s, maybe from Turner Classic Movies. And that was the time of the religious vocation surge in our culture. Seminaries and novitiates were full of members who were ready to minister to the baby boomers who were just being born at that time. Catholic culture, prior to the Second Vatican Council, at that time was steady and sure and legislated and precise, and it operated in kind of a separate culture from the mainline Protestant culture of the time, which surrounded it. But with the Council, all of that changed, as the Church in the modern world called Catholics to re-examine the place within the culture, not outside of it. Myself in religious life, we were called to see ourselves as a part of the laity rather than an extension of the clergy, and to return to the roots of our founding charisms. Within that former time, the isolated Catholic culture easily created a kind of a feeder system for what was called religious vocations, sisters, brothers, and priests. And that remained in evidence as my own baby boomer culture was shaped and formed through experiences in Catholic elementary school, Catholic high school, and Catholic college. I was surrounded by the nuns. I was in relationship with the nuns, and called to join that long line of young women wanting that life as a nun. But wait, now that was the 1960s. Wasn't that the age of Aquarius, the age of radical demonstrations and gatherings at Woodstock? What was I thinking? Only God knew where I was really headed. With that as a backdrop, I invite us to consider what happened to that previous culture of vocations as it lost the feeder system within an isolated Catholic culture. As a person myself who worked in vocation ministry in the 1980s and again after 2000, as well as the Chicago Archdiocese during that time, I recall some beginning challenges we faced. We found ourselves regularly surprised that there were fewer and fewer young people coming to our programs, and fewer even willing to enter our congregation and make a commitment. Of course, now, in hindsight, we understand we were working with persons that the culture names now Generation X, and there were just fewer of them in general, and mostly less connected to institutions. But was that the real challenge? The phenomenon continued well past the year 2000 into the next generation called the millennials, who again had another agenda. These younger people had less and less experience of any distinctly isolated Catholic culture. The feeder systems no longer brought them to consider religious vocations. Instead, it was probably a Google search. So apart from locating young people to be invited to priesthood or religious life, the next challenge in those years was trying to keep tabs on where they were heading. We saw they constantly moved, changed jobs, postponed commitments, dropped in and out of church membership, and began to initiate their own movements and groups to meet the needs of the culture today, either domestically or somewhere else on planet Earth. So these two generations, millennials, Generation X, roughly those folks who followed the boomers, because everything is based on the boomers, of course. Those two generations who are out here in this audience are now fast becoming the dominant Catholic culture in North America and the United States. And the millennials now outnumber the boomers. And it's causing a shift in our Catholic demographics, beginning with a huge decline in church membership, along with major shifts in racial and cultural and ethnic makeup. And finally, a shift maybe in what it might mean to be Catholic today. We see changes in parishes with mergers and closures, religious congregations merging, and some coming to the end of their existence. So the nature of priesthood, brotherhood, sisterhood is shifting dramatically in the face of the new culture in which Catholicism exists. There's so many changes, so much continues to crumble around us as we steady ourselves, looking, searching, building, in an attempt to create this new vocation culture, different from the past. So after naming where we've been, it's best to note that looking to where we're going is always more difficult. So since none of us has some kind of crystal ball, but here's my attempt to imagine that uncertain future in maybe 4 words. First of all, vigilance. To create a new culture of vocations, one must approach the current culture with an open heart, an open mind, open ears, open eyes, to be attentive to what is already emerging in the lives of those younger members of society who are being called by God, called to something that might not yet be in existence. Can we companion that call? Can we allow that call to emerge as God intends it, rather than as we want it to emerge for our congregations or for our dioceses? Are we attentive and vigilant to God's direction to the ministry of vocations? What new culture of vocations does God dream for our world? Number 2, movements. How much do I know about movements springing up among young people right now? How are young committed Catholics finding one another and forming networks of support and service? I suspect that many of our parishes, dioceses, congregations are kind of missing opportunities to journey with young adults within those movements that are, next page, that are flying under the radar. They are local movements, national, international, face-to-face, personal, using the latest in technology and connected with each other moment by moment. Where do we find them? How do we interact with these newly emerging movements? Number 3, justice. Where do I find myself engaged with the important issues of justice and peace in our world? That's where the young, committed, gospel-grounded persons of our world rally themselves today. We only need open our eyes to the young in Charlottesville, Virginia last week, to those who joined the Women's March last January, to those in the Earth Day demonstrations last April. These young persons, whether church members or not, are hearing a call to engage in movements larger than themselves, to make a difference in the world that they care about passionately. These young people remind me of the days of the early church, on its mission to share the good news of Jesus. They remind me of the spirits of our founders and foundresses. So am I standing with these young movers and shakers of today? How am I in relationship with these movements? And 4th, together. There's no real cultural vocations in this 24th century that will exist without being in communion with each other, doing this together, seeking the greater good for all. This means setting aside any narrow, self-directed efforts to succeed in an isolated vocation ministry. Today's culture of vocations is at the service of those who are experiencing the call of the divine in this new context for a new world community. In conclusion, perhaps the next step into the future culture of vocations is as close as tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. What can I dream for tomorrow? What step can I take to creatively engage the culture of today and tomorrow? A full range of possibilities exists out there if we become a creative force inviting those new facets into existence. Hard questions, but good ones to ponder.
As we were singing the closing hymn at Mass today, it was brought back to on a mission from our Vocation Congress 15 years ago. My involvement in vocation ministry was really focused on the 3 years of 2000 to 2003, the preparation leading up to the Vocation Congress, the actual event, and then the writing of the pastoral plan that followed. So when I was reflecting on what I might say today, I wanted to shape it in terms of bringing back that event, not just the event itself, but all that led up to it and what came out of it, as perhaps a paradigm where we can sort of look back and say, where have we come from and where are we going? Those who were involved planning the Congress might remember that it was originally supposed to happen at the beginning of October 2001. And there was a synod of bishops going on in Rome at the same time. I believe it was a synod on the Word of God. So we were asked to move it till the following spring. And then 9/11 happened on September 11th that year. We were just looking back and saying, what if we had tried to organize an international conference 3 weeks after 9/11? Just the logistics alone would have been crazy. So we thought that we were, at that time of world crisis, we were spared having to deal with that, and we could sort of prepare for a congress in the spring. It was going to be a great lead up to World Youth Day that Brother Tom was so capably organizing in Toronto, and to build that bridge between outreach to youth and young adults and vocation ministry, which is sort of being reflected in next year's Synod of Bishops, which is going to be on youth, faith, and vocational discernment. And then, of course, what happened in the U.S. Church in January 2002? Does anybody remember? There was an Oscar-winning movie about it 2 years ago. The Spotlight team in Boston brought out all the stuff about the sex abuse crisis in Boston. And I remember very well the press conference the day before the Congress began, and every question seemed to have to do with, so how is this crisis going to affect the already collapsing vocation ministries in your church? And it seemed to be a time of crisis. And it would have been really easy to sort of either pretend that it wasn't happening at all or to hang our heads in collective shame. One of the most powerful things that happened, I found, during the Congress was the way each of the keynote speakers took that event and acknowledged the anger, the confusion, the pain that many people in the church were feeling at that time, the threat to the church's moral and institutional credibility, but really invited all the delegates, and we were nearly 1,200 delegates gathered in Montreal that weekend, to move towards genuine conversion, to dig more deeply into the heart of the Catholic tradition, and to witness to a transformation that happens when we respond to a deep gospel call, to recommit to our highest ideals. The other thing that happened during the Congress that I found was a real sign of hope, and again it connects with the upcoming synod, was that we worked really hard to get about 125 to 150 young adult delegates present at the Congress. And they brought a real joyful energy. We had them dispersed at the different tables because we wanted cross-pollinization. We didn't want to have just all the vocation directors sitting together and all the bishops sitting together. We wanted a mix. Because we wanted to get the idea through that vocations were everyone's concern. That, as the theme of the Congress suggested, that vocation is the gift of God, but it's given for all of God's people. But what was amazing was this fellowship and community that formed among the young people at the Congress. They had one free evening. Montreal is a great party town. You would have thought that all the young adults would have been out partying on that free Saturday evening. What happened is that they came together, they asked us to organize a meal for them at the hotel, and a bunch of them worked through the night to produce the very first statement that the Congress produced, which was the young adult statement. And when I had the challenge after the Congress of writing the pastoral plan, it was amazing how much of it came out of what the young adults were telling us and the dreams that they had. And I remember some of the words that they expressed. I mean, they were just basic, a desire for a covenant relationship with the church, a desire for open and fruitful dialogue, inviting those who served in church ministries to be credible and generous witnesses, a desire to grow in their own sense of Catholic identity, a commitment to human dignity, a desire for an open and inclusive church, genuine experiences of Christian community. And what they asked for most specifically was for mentoring, for guidance, for encouragement, for opportunities to grow in prayer and assistance in discerning the path on which God was calling them. They invited us to a profound trust in God, but also to a profound trust in them. For they are not only, as we say, the future of the church, but they were the present of the church. And that, I found, after finishing my work on the Congress, I worked as a university chaplain, and then I worked in seminary formation for several years. And I remember talking to some of my university students in the aftermath of the conference, of the Congress, and saying, well, what's it like for you guys? When you think about vocations, what do you think? And certainly what became clear was a lot of the insights of the pastoral plan that came out after the Congress were important. One of those important paradigm shifts, and I think we've seen it in our ministries, is the shift from a recruitment promotion paradigm to a discernment and accompaniment paradigm. And I think there's all the difference in the world. Young people know when they're being recruited, and they also know when they're being accompanied and journeyed with. And when they experience the latter, they tend to be more open to a call, because the call is not about satisfying somebody else's need. It's about coming to that place where, in that beautiful phrase of, I think, Frederick Buechner, that you meet your vocation at that place where your own deepest desires encounter the deep hungers of the world. And I find young people resonate to that message. And they also resonate to something else, which I think has been one of the maybe great successes of the last 20 years, is the shift from a paradigm to being a vocation being something that some people have and some people don't, to the reality that we all have a vocation, that we all have a calling from God. And I think that is something that has taken root. When we talk about a vocation culture, I think that's the fundamental insight, that God is calling all of us to life, to love, to holiness, to discipleship, to service, and to mission. How he calls us and how that call unfolds is different according to one's state of life, but also according to one's particular gifts. I found in my ministry with young adults that this whole idea of the personal vocation, that vocation is not primarily a state of life to which you're called, but that God has called each one of us uniquely by name, and that God has given us a particular set of gifts and talents, but also limitations and a history, and that God speaks to us through all of that. And I think young people resonate to that message, and they desire to grow, they desire to discover who they are. They face all kinds of challenges. There are many voices competing for their attention, but I think that for me, one of the fruits of the conference was the recognition that this is the fundamental call. If you remember the pastoral plan, which came out in 2003, there were 3 words that focused in the title, and the words were conversion, discernment, and mission, fostering a vocation culture in North America. So I think each of those words was significant, and they were significant 15 years ago, and I think they're still significant today. We are all called to ongoing conversion, and that's both at the personal level, but also at the level of our dioceses, our religious congregations, our families, our church as a whole. We're called to an ongoing transformation of consciousness and an openness to what the signs of the times are revealing to us about the world and about the people that we journey with. We're called to discernment, and that's really a careful attention to the signs of the times, and in a particular way to the world that young people are experiencing and some of the challenges. I appreciated what Sister Sharon said about what is drawing young people, what do they want, what are they committing themselves to, and how are we connecting and journeying with that. And also mission. I think that it's a shift from vocation as some kind of personal or individual predisposition, seeing myself as a priest or a sister or as a deacon, but getting young people involved in concrete projects, inviting them to share in the life and ministry of the church, and then within that process, within the relationships that they form with the people they encounter, discovering within that experience a call to something bigger, something larger.
If you get a chance to get your hands on LCWR's publication, The Occasional Papers, there was at Harvard Divinity School, 2 interns studied the millennials, and there was a gathering of nuns and nuns, the NUNSs and the NONESs together, and they discovered they were kindred souls because of their search for depth and meaning. And as all of us have done in our ministries, you always do a needs assessment before you start. What is it that people need? And I know in my vocation ministry over the years, it's listening to what young adults say. This is what we need. And creating a vocation culture shaped by their desires and their hungers. So a few of those hungers that I've heard from young adults, and I worked with a huge diversity of people in LA, you can imagine. Okay, not only cultural diversity, every kind of diversity, every ecclesiology. But in common, I heard a hunger to experience God. Please give us some opportunities to experience God. Teach us how to pray. How do we meditate? We want spirituality. And I found it didn't matter where somebody was on the spectrum of ecclesial sense of church, there was this consistent hunger for a God experience. And as we all know, that's like at the basis of having a sense of where God is calling us. And so another desire was to get inside the door, to experience what life is like inside that convent, rectory, brothers, friary, a monastery. And I loved at this Continental Congress, the young adults stayed up all night, wrote that statement. You know how they did it? Some worked on it a couple hours, left it by the door of the next person. Remember that? Like 3 in the morning. They trusted each other to continue editing and producing the document. And we got it like the next day. Number one thing I remember about that was hospitality. Please invite us in. Let us in the door. Another hunger was, we want to hear the stories. They could never hear enough stories of why you felt called to diaconate or being a brother. I never got tired of hearing the same stories, people I had invited. So the story has the dynamism of call within call. And the other was this hunger for discernment. Teach us how do we know what God's will is? Teach us, give us discernment skills. So we shaped events to create a culture of vocations around these hungers and desires. And we went as mainstream as we could, as possible. Because in working with young adults, and now we're working with Generation Z, which is very exciting, anybody born 95 and after. I love the energy of Generation Z because they're born connected. They're born with a cell phone in their hand, in the labor room almost. They're born with a sense of a collective consciousness, more global. Millennials, they could work well in small teams and small groups. But, oh no, Generation Z, they want to be part of a global reality, a collective consciousness. And so if we're going to be really credible and authentic and relevant vocation people, we need to be really connected and literate and keep on learning about that. So given those hungers, I think what we created, we moved beyond the come and see retreat to like silent directed retreats where you have your own spiritual director for 3 days. You see him once a day. Silence, maybe all night adoration. And boy, that took off because there was this hunger for God. And we created things like spiritual direction banks where we created, here's some spiritual directors that understand young adults and millennials and now Generation Z that you can meet with once a month. They love that. Having seminar days with topics that they requested and they wanted to hear about. Like what is a charism and what is the diversity of charisms about? How can I go deeper in my prayer life? What's the spirituality of priesthood? And I'd always get somebody who tried it and left, always to share. I tried the seminary, or I tried being a brother, and because always we'd say it's a win-win situation. But all of their topics and their hungers, and that worked really well. And then I found so many people who wanted to learn how to discern, but they sure didn't want to do it with their sorority or their fraternity or their family members knowing. And so I started Vocations Anonymous groups in English and Spanish. We had like 17 of them going on, and they could go across town and meet in a group and be secret, for the call that won't go away. And so those were helpful because it was a systematic approach to teaching people how to discern, using maybe Thomas Green's book, Weeds Among the Wheat, but a systematic, week after week. And then we found that the desire to get into the door, what we did with that was we created 7-11 ministry days. And we could have 200, you remember Christine, I think you were at some of those. 200 young adults would come and we'd invite diocesan priests and brothers and sisters and we'd say, what do you want to experience for the day? The life of a cloistered nun, a missionary, the Brothers of Charity feeding the homeless under the freeway, you want to go to prison? So they picked their ministry and where their energy was in terms of religious life or diocesan priesthood. But we did it like live a life for one day. So we showed up like 7 a.m. because we did morning prayer, meditation, we did breakfast. Then we went out. They all went out all over the city. Then they came back for Mass, and we had the Knights of Columbus put on prime rib dinner or something, tri-tip dinner, and we had a talent show with only sisters, brothers, priests in it, seminarians and novices, and night prayer. And then a reflection. But it was getting inside, and they always begged us for that. And I see a lot of movements where people are inviting young adults to come to dinner once a week, or come and pray with us once a week, and that was echoed. So going mainstream, I always think every one of us comes from a culture, a city, a state where certain things are highlighted and everybody's tuned in. So for us, it was the Rose Parade. And so our Vocations in Progress program, which was for teens, they would go help build a float with some sisters. Okay, so you're working alongside a sister. We piggybacked on the LA Marathon and did that for 20 years, where we had seminarians and priests, even a few bishops tried it. They kind of bailed after 7 miles, but religious. Then parishioners said, we want to be part of this, because it was a prayer sponsor drive too. And then the city would call me every year, aren't we having the Vocations team come? So the word Vocations got into the parlance of the city council and the city planning, and we always had the same color shirts. So I think if we piggybacked on major cultural events, it gives us that vocation culture mainstream spread and visibility. So I thought that was great. And then what I've noticed with never-ending hunger for the stories and for discernment is there's some wonderful online resources, and we all need to be using social media. The Nuns Life, it is brilliant. The podcast, you can pray evening prayer with the nuns if you want. Men and women join. Everything that they do is well done. But all of us need to be on top of that. And then, of course, you have to have food and fun. If you have any kind of vocation event that's going to be something they'll come back to, there has to be lots of food and fun. So, we even did a shower for the women before they entered the convent. They weren't going to get a bridal shower. We did a shower. Oh, it was fun. Games. Can't tell you about them, but they were. And then, how am I doing here? Okay. And then also, so I think that there's so much that's vital and alive, and that we create then a sense of vocation as something dynamic and organic. It keeps changing, because if we keep listening to God's call, then we have to keep moving with the next invitation, and that makes vocation not this static moment in time when God called me. But Evelyn and James Whitehead say it well. Vocation's a conversation with God. If you stay in that conversation, you're going to end up places you never thought you'd be. So it's that call and response that goes on. And for the future, I think reading that article and listening to people and looking at Generation Z, it has to be about relationships. In the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, go in and give that vocation talk, rah, 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 at the high school. Go hit all the high schools. Go hit all the colleges. It has to be about cultivating relationships with trust, where there's ongoing connection. And we can do it now much easier with social media. We have to continue with the hospitality, inviting people in. We have to stay connected. The Hilton Fund for Sisters funded, so we have 2 sisters. We also have priests on USC and UCLA campuses. They're doing a lot of outreach and vocation work, and it's really good, but we need to do more of that presence that has a consistency and a fidelity about it. And that we keep in the article, or the Harvard Divinity students study, they said we need eldering mentors. And the desire, as both of you said, to have a mentor that can help walk me through the search for depth and meaning in my life. Somebody who can teach me how to pray and help me, that I can check out my experiences of God with. So I think providing those things are very important. And then internationally, I've been to a lot of countries because I wanted to study the culture when we were doing formation with Nigerians and Vietnamese and Ugandans. I wanted to be able to understand. And I noticed every country has a very distinct socio-context and ecclesial context, and their vocation ways are so totally different. Very different than the US, but even every African country different from one another. In fact, the Ugandan vocation director came to visit me after I'd been there for a while, and I came back and he said, wow, discernment, that's an interesting concept. Because they have so many little boys, I saw them, they were 13 and they were all in black ties and white shirts in this one seminary. And discernment isn't part of the culture, whereas in Vietnam there's so much suffering and persecution They don't need billboards for vocations. They can only take 2 diocesan seminarians, 2 that the government approved of. So there's underground. I visited the Daughters of Charity underground novitiate. I visited the underground seminaries bishops have. And so what's exciting is the diversity of approaches, but it's whatever time we're living in, our socioeconomic circumstances, our ecclesiology, that's what should shape. But most of all, the hungers and the needs and desires of the people that we cast the net out.
I had written a text, but 2 weeks ago I ripped it up and said, I just wanted to listen to what they said and then reflect on that. And also to share with you some vignettes of the past few years. Because the jobs I've had, the ministries I've had, have given me some insights into vocations that I probably never would have received. From my own community, I've been a professor at the university, the Faculty of Theology. I was formation director, I was a general counselor, and then I was thrust into the World Youth Day experience, which really was a world experience. And after that, this stuff with the Vatican, and which gave a whole other perspective. So my reflections are going to come from those things. Several years ago, in the capacity of leading Salt and Light, I was doing serious interviews, not like last night. I was interviewing then Archbishop Tobin prior to his exile to the United States. I was at the Vatican in the Congregation for Religious Sickle Cell and did this wonderful witness interview with him. And one of the lines he spoke to me, I'll never forget. We're talking about vocations. And he says, Tom, the fundamental thing is that the Holy Spirit has a very poor sense of geography. So I looked at him and I was thinking, I'm going to edit this part out. I didn't edit it out. He said, because some countries and some cultures are bursting at the seams with vocations and others are not. And this is really the Holy Spirit's fault. I smiled at that, but I've given a lot of thought to that because when we assess or talk about vocations from the North American context, in many cases it is the North American context. The language, the framework, the issues, the comparisons are all from our side. Several years ago when I was privileged to be part of the apostolic visitation of women religious, which was a really important experience in my life, Sister Claire is one of the great women religious in the country, Claire Malaya, an apostle of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, appointed 3 priests. The Vatican appointed 3 of us to be the visitors. And they gave me the mixed communities of men and women, the new communities of men and women, the new communities with the glossy brochures, with all the vocations, like you say, wow, we're back. The 50s and 40s never really left, we're back. So I remember telling Claire, why did you put me there? She said, there's a reason why. And in visiting some of those communities, I realized that that boom that you referred to of the 1940s and 50s, even into the 60s before the council, was really a blip on the history, the screen. It was a blip in history. And that's a very important thing for us to remember. Because if we compare our present situation with the 40s and 50s, we are not being faithful to history, the history of the church. It's never been a story of huge numbers. It's never been a story of conformity. It's never been a story of habits. I remember the communities I had to visit for the apostolic visitation. I would ask, and there were very fine communities. The hospitality was out of this world. But I said, Sister, why did you join X community? Because of the habit. Why are you with the sisters? Because the pictures are beautiful. We all look alike and we do this and everything else. And that was a serious issue for me when you hear that kind of language. Some would claim that that's a huge victory. I would consider that a question mark in terms of authentic, vital, healthy piety and devotion. So that's one of the first things I think in our attraction or work with vocations today is to listen to those stories and to listen to the questions and the reasons that people are coming with and let the red flags go up in our minds when the base of our choice is only on the 40s and the 50s and once upon a time. You know, our story is not Julie Andrews and The Sound of Music. And by the way, she left the convent peacefully. Okay. Those caricatures, as nice as they may be on TV, are not necessarily what we're about. And that's one of the lessons I've learned. The second lesson is in these past years as heading a Catholic television network, we are loaded with phone calls. Communities call me and say, we want you to make a movie. I said, okay, what would you like the movie on? Father, we've got 70 in the novitiate. I said, 70? Where is this? And they tell me where it is. What would you like us to show? The numbers, the numbers. Show everybody singing. Show all the guys dressed like this. Show all the women dressed like this. So usually I go and meet with them. They say, Father, how much we'll pay? Anything, just make us look good. And I said, well, that's not necessarily what the story is. Because for us, by the way we do it, when we tell stories, it's the personal witness. It's interviewing the people. What drew you to this? And who drew you to this? And then going to the older sister or the older priest and having them tell their story. Because it's that sharing of stories. The third point I've learned with all of this, and you've touched upon it, several of you, is this whole social media. This is a connected generation. All my priesthood has been with young adults. 31 years priesthood. I love it. But this whole social media thing has got some red flags to it. While we may think it connects people, there's never been a lonelier group of people than there is at present. And I mean loneliness. Loneliness because they're relating to screens, they're relating to this, and you know what the opposite of discernment is? It's to Google. Okay? Discernment is the long, painful process of what is God asking of me? Where am I in God's plan? What is this? Google is the quick answer. When Pope Francis speaks about discernment, and he's really good about this too, for those of you at the NCBD conference last year in Kansas City, I spoke specifically about Francis's understanding of discernment. It is not to Google. As good and important as social media is, nothing can take away from the encounter with a person. To sit with an older sister, or a middle-aged sister, or a brother, or a priest, or someone who left and is happy, and to say, what drew you, or why did you decide to leave? So we should be very careful of that. Third point is, where are we fishing for vocations? You know, I teach the resurrection narratives and the story of the primacy of Peter. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? That beautiful story. If you read that, John chapter 21, they were fishing all night and they caught nothing. Luke also mentions that earlier on, but it's a post-resurrectional story in John. And so, you know, you got the scene of they're out there in the boat carrying on and complaining, Peter's naked and everything else, and Jesus says, cast your net on the other side. In other words, you've been fishing on the wrong side. You're fishing in the wrong waters. And that's a message I've learned. Where are we looking for vocations? It's not going to be from the nice, clean-cut, perfect, holy Joe or Mary that went to our school and is an alumna or alumnus and is on the list and comes to our prayer. You'd be very surprised where some of these are coming from. They've been out there in the business world. They've been lawyers. Like I got one here that Prevane, the one who did the pity story in the movie last night, the one who looked like he was crying. It's the first time I saw him with tears in that movie last night. He was a lawyer, a litigation lawyer, making huge bucks. He's now working for me, making very little, but he's happy, okay? I've got medical students that are fed up with the profession at times. There's a whole group of adults that got MBAs and degrees, and they did wonderful stuff, but they're hungry. And that's the group of people we should be paying attention to. Ones who went off and took no theology and philosophy in university, and yet they're searching for something. Those are the waters where we have to throw our nets at times. Another thing about the World Youth Days. Obviously, 4 years of my life were given to the World Youth Days. I believe very much in the World Youth Days. But, and I say the but, and I've shared this with Cardinal Farrell, who's a real godsend now in that capacity. The World Youth Days are not big splashes about numbers, because it got to the point of saying milioni, the millions of people. Let's be honest, folks. How much evangelization could be done with millions? So I'm very grateful the next World Youth Days in Panama, because it will bring the numbers down back to that original dimension that John Paul II had hoped for. Our World Youth Day, and I'll end with these points. We were planning World Youth Day, and halfway through the planning, we have September the 11th. You can imagine what that did for security numbers, insurance, and everything else. Then we had the earthquake of January the 6th, 2002, that Ray referred to. What on earth does this mean, sex abuse and everything else? That kind of colored things. Then we had the illness, the frail body of John Paul II. It was quite something. So when I went to our bishops, I said, there's got to be two things we're going to do at our World Youth Day. We need to have a very visible vocation pavilion, because the first vocation pavilion ever was in Toronto. And you know what they said to me? They said, that's the last thing you want to emphasize right now. I said, no, we need a very strong vocation pavilion. I put a Jesuit in charge of it. We had 55,000 young people go through that every day. And I'll never forget this one scene. I come out of my office, I was with I had guards with me the whole time. I was going from one venue to the other, and I found an American cardinal, an old cardinal, he's retired now, and he was on the street corner and he was crying. Just dressed in civilian clothes. I said, Your Eminence, what's wrong? He said, Tom, he said, look at this. He said, these kids, I think they still love us. And I'll never forget that because they're all taking pictures with him and everything else. And he said, whose idea was this vocation pavilion? We need to have an alternative, a counter response to the evil, the negativity, the signs of death. And ours, in that case, was the vocation pavilion. The other thing they told me to downplay, they said, don't put a lot of emphasis on the media center. You know, it'll bring too many. We had 4,200 accredited journalists at the World Youth Day in Toronto. Half of them came to expect the Pope die in Toronto. 4,200 accredited and 800 more that snuck in. And I said, no, we need to be there, we need to put an emphasis on that and get the story out. And Dr. Navarro Valls of happy memory, he died a couple months ago, and John Paul II said to me that the media center in Toronto were the most positive, hopeful centers, that against the backdrop of scandal, of world terror, everything else, we gave an alternative. And I think that's what we have to do in terms of our so-called dearth and vocations. Never give up on getting the story out, getting the image out, and don't be afraid of telling our story with joy.